to be working, even back in the 50s before the superheroes came along. I mean, it was such fun. 5 and 6 page stories. It was just perfect. I lived up in state, which I still do, and I'd come down every Friday and I'd park my car 238th Street in the Bronx, take the subway down. I wouldn't even lock the car. This was 1949, 1950. And Stan would he'd be sitting there at his typewriter, and you have a whole stack of yellow scripts there, and he'd take one off and he'd hand it to you. He didn't look to see what it was. See, the one you brought in may have been a Western. All right, he may have given you a war story, but he didn't know it, see? So you brought it in the next week, you know. You were expected to do the job, you know. And like I said, I think of all the years I spent there, I was asked to do a new character called Arrowhead. He was an Indian character. And he was like a renegade. And so I brought it home. I started reading the script, and it said, you know, the splash said, show a montage of what an Indian camp looked like, you know, in the Old West. We want Arrowhead standing right there in the middle, and around him show the squaws running up a rug, and the kids playing with balls. And another shot, maybe one of the young Indians would be coming in with the deer over his shoulder, things like that. So when I brought it back, I thought it looked pretty good, all things considered. This was 1953. And Stan says, Joe, and he was right. He said, Joe, it has no guts. And you know, Stan was the guy that, if you were having someone push open the door like a Viking or whatever, and you drew what you thought was a pretty good shot, he would want you to have that Viking 6 inches from the ground, really pushing that big wooden door open or whatever, you know. And you couldn't exaggerate enough for Stan, really. And but I think that's what made him a good editor, really. And, but anyway, Arrowhead. So he said to me, Joe, just show me an Indian running right at you with a tomahawk. You know, that'll make the reader want to turn the page to see what he's coming after, what he's going to do. Not just the guy standing there with, you know, little things going on in the camp. You know, nobody was interested in that. He said. Not that Stan was all for violence, Gene, but he liked to exaggerate things. You know?
Oh, yeah.
So that's the one thing I would always associate with Stan.
You ever see him stand up on a desk?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah.
He'd stand up on top of his desk. I want it this way.
Yeah. Well, Stan should have been an actor. He really, really. But you're right. He would act out how he wanted the character to appear or to react to something, you know.
Yep.
And it was always exaggeration, you know.
Always.
Yeah.
Always. But he would act it out.
Yeah.
He reminds me of Jack Lemmon.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but he does. He's got that boyish attitude.
He does. He always did have it, you know.
Oh, you know, before we go to John, how many people in here have
Interesting 8-page stories. Unfortunately, they're thinning them out so they'll run 13 issues or something like that. The easy read, here's a story beginning, middle, and end has virtually disappeared in comics. I guess we could blame Stan in a way for that, but when Stan wrote these stories, he made sure that if that was the first comic you ever saw, you know what was going on in it. I keep running into so many books where you're totally lost if that's the first comic you've ever seen, and that's a real shame. The big change that has happened since about 1980 is that comics turned away from the newsstands and aimed at a much smaller, more fragmented market. When Bob and I got into comics, you could go into any place in the country, and this is certainly true of these fellows here, any place, any little town in the country, and pick up a comic that we had worked on. And our names were in there, and you got to see it, and you got to know the people and the characters. That is no longer true. There are actually places in this country where comics originated, the comic book originated here, where you might have to travel 100 miles to find a comic book. The last time I was out in the town that I grew up in Washington was 2001. And I walked around there, and I've never felt so depressed in my life. Because if I was 13 then, I would not have been able to find a comic book in the entire town. When I was there, living there as a kid, there were at least 50 outlets that I could get around easily for comic books. That's no longer true. 1950, Superman sold somewhere over 1 million copies. And there was true pass along to other readers. So there were maybe 4 million people out of 150 million in the country who read Superman that issue. Now Superman sells about 65,000. It's pathetically sad. And maybe there was an inevitability about it because Walmart and places like that came into a town and 40 little places that once sold comics were gone. And maybe the comic book publishers did the only logical thing. They turned to the smaller audience where they could charge a bit more and where they didn't have to worry about returns of comics. And I guess you could make a good case that they saved comics by doing that. But I don't know. In other countries, comics are still a healthy thing. In Japan, there's something like 1/4 of all publishing. And here, where they originated,
40% by volume, 25% by money.
is it? Well, the people who should be out there reading comics and enjoying them, if they can find them, they get this thing that they don't quite know what to do with because it's so convoluted and overblown. And so many people know comics from the movies that have been Spider-Man, of course. I remember in 1989 when the first Tim Burton Batman came out, a friend of mine told me he saw a little kid, maybe 9 or 10 years old, who had actually seen a Batman comic, which was unknown or becoming unknown at the time. And the kid said, "Oh, they made a comic out of that movie." And of course, it's just the other way around. Maybe Rob can tell us something about how more personal things with the changes over the years.
Well, my personal experience of the way things have changed for me probably started around the mid-90s at DC when my work started to thin out a bit, and I was wondering why. I kept asking people, you know, why am I not getting more work? And it turns out that a lot of younger editors were coming into the business, and they chose to work with younger artists who they felt they could bring along and relate more to than working with older artists. So eventually I just found myself getting no work at all in DC. And I kind of struggled along for 6 or 8 months, which was not like the 6 years that Gene had to struggle. But I did finally end up at Archie Comics, where age didn't seem to be a factor. In fact, there are artists working there who are 20 years older than myself, and they're probably going to be working there until they are no longer able to, because I think at Archie they respect the experience, and they're not looking for the sort of for the next big thing to come along. So that's sort of what my personal experience has been.
And it's 4 it's 4 o'clock. The convention is like ending now. So we're going to have to end this panel, even though I'm sure we could go on until 4 o'clock tomorrow and not repeat anything. But thanks for coming, and thank you guys for, I guess, together about 150 years of comics.
Can I say
Right
one
here.
more thing?
One more thing.
One more thing.
Who better to end this?
No, I would love to see publishers put out comic books for women. 98% of people that show up at conventions are guys. I don't see women. I see them with their husbands, and I see an occasional girlfriend come in, but they don't show up. That's because there's nothing out there for them to read. Now, there used to be romance comics, and they should come back to it. Something should happen, and there's a whole area out there that should be recognized and have not been recognized. And it's something that I think they've forgotten.
Ken, we got 160 years right here between the two of us.
160. So
there's another 60 here.
So 220 years of experience is what you guys have been hearing for the last 45 minutes. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. 220 years.
Guys, come out the hall.
You're the only female. I almost said something like that now.
You give me the look.
Yes, I'm like one. Stop talking. Amelia
The Panama Canal, the building of the Panama Canal, it could have been the history of tails. I did a story one time on the animal tails. Every animal has got a tail, of course, but the tail is the most important part of the animal. I mean, you can pick any animal, and the tail is so important to the animal.
I have often suspected that.
You remember that, Joe? So I learned a lot working for Treasure Chest, you know?
Yeah.
Gee, really?
Irwin!
What?
You wake up.
I project, that's my problem. Go ahead.
So you
What?
finally did you graduate that art
I never
academy?
graduated anything.
Oh, well. And,
No, because I tell you, it wasn't necessary. As long as I was able to draw pictures, you didn't have to graduate.
So when
You
you
drew pictures,
so when did you find out about this thing called comic books? And,
comic books. I walked around the corner where I was working in the prize fight business. I was a cartoonist for a prize fight magazine on 42nd Street, New York City. And I got a better offer from somebody. Instead of $4 a week, $6 a week, whatever. And I found out that around the corner from where I was working was the Timely Comics. And I didn't know what that meant, but I took samples to this company, Timely, you know, Silver Clyde, all those guys, pardon the expression, Silver Clyde.
he was at
No, he was a nice guy. Who was the other, his partner?
Goldwater.
Ah.
And that was
That wasn't Tommy, that would have been Archie.
yeah.
That was Ar-
Well, MLG.
MLJ.
MLJ. There you go.
He was,
Huge comics.
I only stayed there for a short while. And that's when I broke into the business. It's by walking around a corner sometimes.
You were in the right neighborhood.
In the right neighborhood.
At the right
And that
time.
was when comic books began. That's when the conception of this new literary thing in America, comic books. At
And
that time.
How did you go over to Timely?
Pardon?
How did you end up going over to Timely?
How'd you find out about
How'd
it?
you
How did I find out?
Just went around the corner?
How did you go to
Corner.
Timely? Yeah.
Stan was on the street
I went
corner.
around.
Oh, Timely.
Anyone know how to draw?
Stan Lee was holding a piece of paper.
Irwin, at Timely, did you work for Stan or for Joe Simon?
No, I never worked for
Did you
Stan.
work for Joe Simon?
Timely, and the other guy, fancy name, Lloyd Jacquet.
So, yeah, they were the
Funny thing.
packager.
Yeah, it was a package
And
place.
they sold it to Goodman.
And I did the ferret. It was the first thing I ever did. Really?
I know.
It's a ferret.
Typecast.
Marvel Mystery Comics #4.
Jenny
And
has
that's
a copy
it.
of it, right?
I'll ferret it out. I wish I had.
So that's it. Simple equation.
Joe, you seem to have you actually kept records of every single
Everything.
story?
My son Mark, he put together an index of all my work about 2 or 3 years ago. And when I looked at it, I couldn't believe it. I said, holy, I did all this work?
Yeah.
I was telling someone before, when we went belly up in '58,
After I was born. Just a coincidence.
So Stan said, we're not going to have any work for at least 6 months. So I started scrounging around. That's when I got Treasure Chest and Encounter Treasure Chest. I did a thing for Classics Illustrated. And so Vince Coletta called me up, and he said to me, Joe, he said, I still have an account over at Charleston. And he said, if you pencil the romance stories for me, I'll ink them. And of course, the rates were horrible. But I had
But
four kids at the time.
Yeah, he ain't like crazy.
Are you kidding? So anyway, so Mark called me up one day when he's doing this index. He said, Dad, do you know how many pages you did for Charlton, for Vince Coletta? I said, gee, it must be 300 or 400. Seemed like I was on it forever. I used to work on that work at night after supper.
Yeah.
I'd do the timely stuff
Yeah.
during the day. So anyway, he said, I counted them all up. He said, you did 2,700 pages of romance.
All inked by
Couldn't
Henry?
imagine. I was almost floored, you know? And, but in any case,
Do you have any of those pages now?
I don't have any of the art, but I got every comic that I ever worked on.
Penciled by
Of course,
Joe,
Mark.
inked by Vinnie Coletta.
Mark, and you know what's funny? Mark's got a website, joesinnet.com, I wouldn't know how to plug a computer in, but he gets emails from all over the world, and people send him books. There's one fellow that sent him every Charlton book that I did the romance stories for, you know? And these are hard to get. Everybody threw them in the garbage can. You know? But, well, you know how it was, Joe, over at Charleston.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
Charlton.
Charlton.
Yeah.
Charlton Publishing.
Yeah,
Charlton,
yeah. So, but Jim,
Sure.
as everybody knows, as Irwin knows, in those days, especially when things got bad in '58, because at the time I worked from '50 to '58 for Stan. I had all the work I ever wanted. I never went to any other place, and you didn't dare turn down a job, Irwin, right? I did billboards, record covers, brochures for, you know, resorts, all that stuff, because you just didn't know where your next job was coming from.
I was, you know, I was always a single man, so I didn't have a responsibility.
Right.
So
Well, it's tough.
I was lucky in a way to have that option of not working 1 week, of, you know.
I'll tell you how naive I was when Stan called up and said, Joe, we're going to have to suspend operations for 6 months or whatever. I went right over to the unemployment, and I stood in line with everybody else. I got up there and I said, I'd like to sign up for unemployment. She said, Joe, I knew the girl. She said, Joe, you can't sign up. You never paid any Social Security.
That's right.
I didn't know we were freelancing. I thought everybody in the country was entitled to a handout.
You found out you never had a job
What
at
a
all? Yeah.
It was called a handout.
Let me ask you, you guys were around, I don't think you were working then yet, but during the 50s when they were having all these investigations into these horrible things called comic books, what was it like when people asked you, friends or, you know, social acquaintances, what do you do for a living?
Oh, it was embarrassing. In fact, TV, when they had the Kefauver investigation, would you believe it was my comic book they held up and said, look at the kind of stuff that the kids are reading, you know? And
Do you remember which
remember
one?
that, Mark? Pardon me?
Which comic was it?
It was called Sarah. That was the name of the story, in fact. It was a horror story,
Oh,
Sarah.
okay.
But our books weren't all that bad. EC's were worse than ours. But it was the small
Always, yeah.
companies that tried to sell their books, and their stuff was pretty gory, you know?
Yeah.
But, of course, it did kill the comic book industry for a while, you know, when they put the code in place.
What were you doing around then, Erwin? Were you already out of comic books or doing strips?
I was
or-
in comic books till 1952.
Yeah, so that's about the time.
51.
Yeah.
And that's when Dondi I got in 54.
How did that happen? Let's hear
What's
that. How'd you go from comic books to doing the nationally syndicated Dondi comic
I would
strips?
say luck. A lot of it's all luck.
You walked around the
That's
corner and
right.
there was Donnie. Right
What?
place.
You walked around the corner.
And there was Donnie on the street.
That's right. You know what? It's almost like that. But it's a lot of it. It's a lot of luck. Even actors, they're in the right place at the right time. Wonderful actors can be out of work for 20 years, 15 years.
Yeah.
And there's always one break.
Yeah.
And that's what they hope for. It's a false gold. It's called false gold.
Wasn't there a point where you were called into an editor's office and they suggested you take a vacation and
Yeah.
you didn't get the full meaning of what they were trying to
Whitney
tell you?
Ellsworth. Whitney
No.
Ellsworth.
Can you tell that story?
Yeah, Whitney Ellsworth, I worked for DC, Sheldon Mayer and all of them. And one day, Whitney Ellsworth, who was the president, managing director of DC Comics, and you know, I was always the kind of a guy, as you can see, is a funny man. I'm humorous, I make fun, I make people like me, and everyone liked me, because that was my shtick, being short. I'm short, so let me make them laugh, so maybe they won't see me. Because when you laugh, your eyes are closed. So one day, Whitney Ellsworth, the director, calls me into his office. And he, in between bottles of booze, really, he calls me and says, you know, Irwin, you know what, you're a sweetheart, you're a hell of a night. We all love you here. You're a real swell guy, and we all love you to be around and all that. Why don't you're a single man? why the hell don't you go out, go travel, go all over the world, for God's sake, you have all the freedom, and I'm standing there. He cares for me. So he said, for God's sakes, you know, go to the bar, have a drink, enjoy yourself, go to a travel agent, take a trip. And I said, Jesus Christ, that's a good idea. I didn't know. I said, thanks, Whit. Thanks, Whit, shit. So I go downstairs to the bar.
You're going to have to sit in the corner. This is your warning now if you do that one more time. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes,
It's
okay.
It's okay, go
You're a
ahead.
good Catholic, and I'm sorry. No, I really mean it. Sometimes I get to, you know.
It's
anyway,
okay.
So I get downstairs to the Hotel Pierre, go to the bar. I had good taste in bars, even as a young man. And I had a drink at the bar, and I went down to a travel agent downtown. Somebody told me to go to this travel agent in case I want to travel. So I booked passage on the Liberté, one of the most exquisite French steamships. It was their final sailing. First class was for second class, so I got a good bargain. And I booked passage. I had $1,200 in the bank, 1,000 maybe. And it's called Nerve, I don't know. And I'll cut this short. And as we're going past the harbor, I see the Statue of Liberty with the torch. And I'm looking and I said, holy shit, I've been fired. Honest to God, that's exactly what happened. I didn't realize that that's the way they did it in those days if they liked you.
Oh.
They fired you.
What did they
But
do
they
if they didn't
gave
like you? What did they do if they didn't like
They
you?
shoot you. Anyway, I went to Europe, and I had a wonderful time. And it's amazing how you can be broke. Of course, there again, I wasn't married.
Of course,
That's the catch.
yeah.
I didn't pay a bad price. I lived all my life like I am now. But I couldn't have afforded to do this grand gesture. And I came home broke. And then I started to join the USO with the Cartoonist Society. And there again, I was at Liberty, and I traveled all over the world with the USO. My father didn't know what the hell was going on with me. He said, how can you travel? You don't have any money. I said, I don't answer you, ask you questions. Don't ask me. I don't know, I'm just doing it. So that's the story of my life. By luck, by making decisions, and
You met Gus Edson
being
on
a cartoon.
And you met Gus Edson on one of those trips.
What?
You met Gus Edson on
Oh,
one of
yeah.
those trips, yeah.
Yeah, on that trip, when I was at USO, I met Gus Edson. And that shows you again,
Yeah.
someone up there is watching out for me.
Sure.
He was the guy.
And I'm not religious, but for some reason or other in my life, there's always some guy up there who said, look, I'm busy with Europe, I've got to fight with Vietnamese. Erwin, are you starting with me again? It's like, he said, all right, look, go to Germany, I want you to meet Gus Edson. And he'll talk to you.
Who is this guy?
Tell us who Gus is.
Gus Edson was a famous cartoonist, Andy Gump, the old days. And his strip was going down the toilet, pardon the expression.
Yeah, that's okay.
And he met me, and he said to me, would you like to do something with me? What are you doing? So when you're not working, you say you're in advertising. And I said, I'm in advertising. So he said, I'll send you something in the mail. And sure enough, he sent me a letter with a picture of the kid, Gandhi. And I looked at it, and there again, it has to do with being your own man, whatever the hell it is. And I looked at that picture of Gandhi sitting on a duffel bag. And I said, Gus, it's like looking across a room and seeing a woman and say, that's going to be my wife. And I saw the picture of the kid. And I said to Gus, Gus, I swear to God, I said, we have the best strip in America. So that was me. Gus was the beginning, but he didn't know what the hell he had. He even made me sell it. He couldn't sell it. He hated business so much because they screwed him at the news, whatever. And he said, you sell it. It was turned down by the news and by King Features. Turned down. These smart asses, they didn't know from nothing. You have to know in your own heart. Now I'm becoming religious. I'm not a Catholic. But believe it or not, it has to do with something spiritual. I don't know what it is. It's like somebody up there likes me, that thing.
Mhm.
It wasn't him up there, it was me. It was me. I took it around to sell it and was turned down by Sylvan Bike, King Features. The Daily News turned it down. And fortunately, we had a wonderful editor there, Mo Riley, who since died very quickly at that time. And he even called it by name. He said, we didn't have a name. And he comes out, we met at a bar, he comes, he says, I got the name for the kid, Dondi. I said, where the hell did you get, no, you're an Irishman. That's a Mexican name, it's a Spanish name, Donde este, you know. And I said, that's the best name. First of all, it's short. On a Sunday page, it fits. D-O-N-D-I.
Sure.
Am I boring you?
No, you kidding?
So I said, where the hell how'd you get Irishman? What the hell did you get Donde? He said, I don't know. I don't know. Give us another drink, bartender. I don't know. And we called it Dondi, 5 letters, easy to read. And that's the way we started. And he took it to Chicago 2 weeks later, because the Chicago Tribune and New York News was the same family.
Sure.
They bought it, like that. And one more year goes by with no money coming in at all, because the syndicate always is, always will be a very tenacious group of businessmen. They have no imagination, except if you're lucky, you get one guy in a corporation, like Mo Riley. If you're lucky. But the syndicate, finally they said, all right, if Chicago took it, we'll take it, the news. But I always hated them. I'll tell you why. They would see you coming, the cartoonists coming into the office building, and if they were in the elevator with you, they wouldn't look at you. Terrible group of men. Terrible group for cartoonists to have to deal with. They just wouldn't acknowledge my presence. I used to have to drop the strips off under the door almost. Yep.
Crazy.
It was the best of times. Somebody said that. It was the best of times and the worst of times. But with all those business guys, we threw them out in a way, and we became the best, one of the great strips in the country at the time. And you look at those, whenever I talk about those guys, let me tell you one more thing and I'll shut up. We went to a promotional thing in Ohio with a group of advertising men. The advertising men hated their guts because you were taking space from Colgate lipstick. Or you're taking up their space. And so Gus and I were sitting on a train on the way to Ohio, and the advertising guys were talking to each other. And we're sitting right there listening. And I'm getting this off my chest because I always wanted to tell somebody this. These bastards were looking at us while talking among themselves about how to get Colgate lipstick on a half page that Dondi was on. Honest to God.
Really?
Now look, we want Colgate, and we want this, and we want that, and you need a half page for this, and we're looking at each other, and we're looking at these bastards. And you couldn't believe, there's almost like they didn't exist, you didn't exist in their eyes. And everybody in New York City was reading the
Sure.
script.
Sure.
You follow what I'm just saying?
Well, so
They
there'll be
stick
free
right out.
Colgate toothpaste on the way out for everyone here.
Well, it was
And some
Colgate.
lipstick,
It
yeah.
could have been Colgate. It could have been a mundane product to
Thank
get
you.
rid of Dundee and give space to Colgate. But they're the two creatives sitting in your eye. Okay, that's it.
And the movie Strangers on a Train was actually influenced.
Really?
Mr. Sinnott, is there any dramatic moments in your career? You mentioned, you rather said it, like as if it was just another day in your life that Stanley called and didn't think there would be much work available in the next 6 months. What kind of impact, how old was little Mark back
He wasn't
then?
even born then.
Wasn't
Mark was born in '61.
He's a baby.
See, when I was born, the comics really took off.
No, of course, that was a great period. I mean, it was an interesting period.
60s.
59, 60.
Yeah.
Of course, Stan was always looking for a new trend. And, hi, Bob. Didn't see you back there. Hey, I should tell you the story about Bob.
Okay.
You go right ahead.
He's a cartoon.
What you were saying just now, no, continue
He
with
came
that.
up to the house
Continue.
with a buddy of his, and they were about, 15 years old?
Yeah.
Right.
No, maybe even.
So they spent all day with me, and I gave them little hints on how to draw this and how to draw that, whatever.
And he was
First thing you know,
he was inking an issue of Fantastic Four at the time.
first thing you know,
The first time I
That
seen.
narrows it down.
Yeah, but what issue?
First, I don't remember. That's something I don't. I
He's
just
not a
remember the
fan.
pencils.
it got to be 10 o'clock at night. They had to go back down to Kingston, which was 10 miles below Saugerties, to get the bus back to New York. So I drove them down, even though it was past my bedtime. I drove the two
In the
kids
snow.
down.
In the
They
snow.
both get down here to the bus terminal, and Bob says, Mr. Sinnott, he said, we don't have any money.
No. Now I have to.
Bob
No,
came
actually,
here,
no, we didn't have.
he used to ride home by
He's
the
right.
way.
We didn't have any money. The thing is, they wouldn't take the tickets. The place wouldn't take the tickets that we bought for a round trip. They
Well,
wouldn't
whatever.
take them.
I had to
Then
pay-
I didn't have any money to pay for new tickets. True.
So I had to pay for your
Yeah.
ticket and Raymond's.
He was so nice. He came by and paid for our tickets. To get home.
And it was.
Come on, everybody, that deserves a round of applause, really. What a guy, really.
That shows a character.
Heart, it's
Character
called
right
heart.
there. Even beyond.
That's right.
Character beyond comics, beyond what the artist, the great artist that he is, not just inker, but artist. That shows character right there.
And I got to
Absolutely.
finish the story with a couple of years
Plus,
ago.
he still made the deadline on the Fantastic Four.
I never missed a deadline.
Exactly.
Well, you know that,
I
Jim.
know that.
Gee. But in any
I
case,
think it was 100, in fact, 100 or 101. It was much later on when you were just finishing up.
but anyway, a couple of years ago, I was 80 years old, and
Me too.
so Mark called up a lot of my friends. Let me hear this, and he
What?
asked them. Quick, Joe's birthday. He wanted to have a big birthday party up at the American Legion Hall in Saugerties. Of course, it was all planned, and that was, 2 days before my wife got very sick. She never came out of the hospital. But he got a drawing from everyone that he, inquired about. And Bob did a drawing for me, beautiful drawing. I mean, I wouldn't sell it for anything. But it's
I got news for you.
it's Bob down at the bus terminal with the snow coming down, and he and his buddy, no money to go back to New York, and I had to foot the bill, But that was great, Bob.
Well, as I said, it's a good example of good
You put a
management.
lot of effort in that,
Yeah.
Yeah, Bob asked me to ask you, he needs a ride home.
Yeah, I just ran out of gas.
Joe, I mean, you started at good old Charlton. And what was that like, and when, were you thinking, well, this is a foot in the door and hope to work at the other companies, or were you happy just to be there? Were you thinking about, this is how I'm thinking of my career, or are you just saying, I'm open to whatever comes along? What's your...
Well, I don't think I ever had a grand plan for a career. I just wanted to draw comics, and Marvel had thrown me out, and DC had thrown me out. And I had done a couple of things for Warren, but no regular work. And actually, I had just gotten married, and had no work, but my wife was working, and we were very...
teacher, I believe.
Yes, right. So we were like totally broke, and we were driving over to Mystic, Connecticut for a very short honeymoon before she had to get back to work. And Connecticut is obviously where we were going, and that's where Charlton was, and I had samples, and we stopped.
Your car broke down outside Charlton Comics.
Just like our, but I went in, and they gave me work. And I was perfectly happy. I was drawing comics, and that's what I wanted to do, and they were paying me very little, so they weren't bothering me on what I did, as long as I got it in. And, you know, I'm a poor boy from down south, so I never expected to make a lot of money. So I was perfectly happy at Charlton. I wanted to move on to Marvel or DC. You know, that was just a career path. That was what you wanted to do. But I was happy to be at Charlton. I loved it.
Was it, well, we heard the sort of origin story of Dondi, but how did your superhero character, E-Man, come about?
Well, Nick Cuddy had been an assistant to Wally Wood, and Sal Gentili was the editor at Charlton when I was hired there, and Sal retired, and George Wildman was the editor, and so he needed a new assistant, and he heard about Nick, and Nick became in as the assistant editor, and we hit it off. And after we did some horror stories together, Nick got to go ahead to do a superhero character, and he just called me in on it. So it was kind of a goofy kind of character that would never have been done at any other company. But I lucked into it.
Well, this is, people always ask, what do editors do?
That's
So
a
you
good
just
question.
heard the real story of how E-Man came about. Now this would be the edited version, that one night you were in your studio and suddenly there was a power failure. It was in the middle of a thunderstorm. You know, you had just taken Joe Sinnott to the train station to go home, where he ran into Irwin Hazen, who was telling stories about how successful he was doing Dondi, and then suddenly it was an epiphany in the darkness of your studio. You were just thinking, oh, this is the pits. If only I had like electrical powers. And then suddenly an imaginary light bulb lit over your head, and you just go, I know, E-Man, and then it goes on and on and on. But maybe that's not better than the real story. But John, you said you really loved working at Heavy Metal, and where you were the art director. And Heavy Metal had a very important role, and like it's sometimes too often overlooked in the sort of the history of graphic novels becoming accepted in this country. Heavy Metal, in a sense, was almost ahead of the curve in bringing that to America.
Well, I had a realization that at Heavy Metal we were kind of carrying the ball for comics in the United States, because the other companies were turning away from the mass audience, from the newsstand, and going toward the emerging comic shops of the time. And we were doing our best to get as big an audience as we could. A good example of the thing about the graphic novel is Alien. We did I never considered it a comics adaptation of the movie. I thought it was a comics version of the movie. Sure. We were working from the script. We were going to do it on paper in comics form. They were doing it with film. And it became the first, as far as I know, comic book or graphic novel to be on the New York Times bestseller list, where it remained for 7 weeks. It was a lot of unintentional stuff there. I always loved Walt Simonson's work, and I thought, Walt can ink this. But the guy who I wanted to pencil it was Carmine Infantino. He was a hero of mine, and he had hired me at DC. And Carmine was out of DC at the time, and he and Walt and he and a million other people had been doing a lot of stuff for Warren. And I liked the gritty look of Carmine and Walt, and I thought, what a vision that would be for Alien. And I called up Carmine, and his phone was busy. I called up Walt, and I said, hey, and he pondered things for a while. I said, hey, how about if I do the whole art job? So Carmine was out, and it became Walt. And then Walt brought in, I thought about writing the script myself, or maybe Walt could do it, but Walt brought in Archie Goodwin, and it was wonderful. We stood back and let those guys do what they wanted to do, and it turned out perfect.
I think I like the graphic novel more than the movie.
In many ways.
I do. It is definitely one, it's probably the best movie adaptation or version anybody ever did.
I think so.
And it's still one of the best graphic novels.
It stands
It
on its
really
own.
is.
There you go. Erwin,
Yeah.
speaking of graphic novels, isn't there something coming out in the future from you, actually?
Not, it's in the hopper.
Well,
It's
can
on
you-
the, it's on the oven. It's
Can
on
you just
the
give us a
oven.
little tease? I mean, what the...
It's a story of my life,
There you go.
but it's not a story per se.
When did you do it?
25 years ago, going on next week. Really.
Okay. What inspired you? What made you think you should do
I had a
this?
relationship with a woman, not my wife, who knocked the hell out of me in my mind. And I sat down and I wrote it. And I drew pictures, lovely pictures, the best drawing I've ever done in my life. It took me 20 years to keep working on it. It's something I had to do. And I gave it to a few publishers, and it was too racy, quote, racy, at that time, 20 years ago. So I showed it to Joe Kubert. I worked for him as a teacher. And he looked at it. And this is the last kind of a project he would ever get involved in. Joe is a very, what's the word? Basic, decent, not like me. But he was a family guy, and it really is
He was like Joe.
terrific guy. Yeah, exactly.
But not
You know what?
that way.
It's like showing it to Joe. Really, I mean it. But it was beautiful. It was beautiful. And he happened to see it, and he said, Erwin, that's got to be published. I said, Joe, I've had it for 20 years. He said, Erwin, get it, I want you to publish that. So to make a long story short, and believe me, I know how to make a long story long. He gave it to this guy, what's his name?
David Spurlock. Spurlock.
Spurlock, a man named David Spurlock. And Joe said, I want this published. That's the kind of a guy Joe Kubert is. He said to this guy, I said, Joe, I'm not keen on this man. He's not simpatico with me. I said, I'll bet you he's going to give you problems. And sure enough, he fought it for a year. And finally, this 6 months ago, he started to publish it. He's putting it in the works, putting it in the hopper. And if it gets published, it'll be something.
And the title?
Huh?
What's it called?
What's it called?
What's it called?
Erwin.
It is? Okay. I thought it had another
No,
name.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I got a mental block.
What's it called, Danny?
It's called Loverboy.
Loverboy.
Oh, there you
A
go.
Loverboy.
The Erwin Haysom story.
And it has to be a story about a guy who was in love with a big, tall, beautiful woman. A little
Say
guy.
no more. We lose our imagination for the rest. But
No, it has nothing to do with
I
what you
know.
have to
Why not? I'm not buying it then, but
Anyway,
Joe,
you brought this thing up.
that's true.
And it's possible it may be published, and if it's published, it may go somewhere. Because there's a lot of facets to it. As you know, I'm a very faceted man. Anyway, that's enough of that.
Joe, all this talk of graphic novels. And all
Oh,
that,
yeah.
When you were at Treasure Chest, you did a whole lot of stuff that people who know your work from Marvel may be unaware of. I know some of it you might be particularly proud of. Is there a few things you want to talk about there?
Actually, Jim, the work I did for Treasure Chest was the best art that I ever did.
I love to hear this. Go ahead. I mean,
No,
I'm very serious.
I did a couple things for Dell, which I like. I did The Life of the Beatles,
I
64
know.
pages,
And you did it in a very short period of time.
30 days.
Exactly.
Pencil and ink.
It was And you had like very limited reference, it was just
Oh,
a few.
at that time, the Beatles, hardly anybody knew of the Beatles. It was 1964,
Right.
and they wanted to get the book
Takes a
out.
lot of guts to do that kind of a project.
Well, they wanted to get the book out before they appeared on Ed Sullivan's show.
Yeah,
Remember?
right.
And like I said, I found one magazine that had pictures of the Beatles. So I didn't have a Lacy Lucy or anything in those days. I used to look at the pictures and draw them just like this. You can imagine how much time that took, you know? And but Dick Giordano helped me on some of the pages, the Ringo Starr segment. But like I said, 64 pages in 30 days, it was unbelievable. And I also did the TV show 12 O'Clock High, which I really enjoyed doing. I love doing airplanes. The trouble was they didn't cancel the TV show, so they had to cancel my comic book, you know? But
Was that never published?
But oh, sure.
Oh, okay.
There were about 4 or 5 books published, right, Mark?
Well, let me just
Yes,
comment on
yes, it
the... Over here, Mr. Cameraman. But with the Beatles, I didn't know until you just mentioned that. Are you saying it was actually, the comic came out before the Ed Sullivan appearance?
We made it just before the,
Wow. Yeah,
they
I mean,
appeared.
there's a couple of things that have happened in comics history that is little known. I mean, I didn't know until now
Yeah.
that Beatles thing was actually...
But-
I thought they were the phenomenon first, and this was...
The
a follow-up
Treasure Chest,
comic
of
book.
course.
Who knew?
We had some good people working there. Reed Crandall worked there.
Sure.
And they used to give, they had Fran Matera, you remember
Yeah.
these guys, Irwin.
Yeah.
And Ray Borth, not Ray Borth, what was his name? First name, last name was Borth, B-O-R-T-H. But in any case, the first story, the script they gave me was The Life of Joyce Kilmer. So I did a job on it that they liked, so they used to give me all the biographical stories. I did the lives on 3 or 4 popes, Babe Ruth, Ty Cobb, I could go on, the Wright brothers, Alan Shepard, the astronaut, and I used to get all the biographical stuff. And poor Reed Crandall, he used to get the building of the Panama Canal, the bridge, but he was up to it. He did a beautiful job.
Well, he was a great contractor.
Oh, and all that stuff, you know. And but to this day, it was the best art I ever did, you know. Although I did some stuff in the 50s for Stan.
Oh, yeah.
I thought they were good stuff. You know, my own pencils and
yeah.
inks, you know, westerns, war stories, and whatever, you know.
Well, even when I was the first editor, I think DeFalco finished it off on the Marvel's Pope comic, and you
Oh,
inked
wasn't
that over
John Tartaglione was a guy that was so underrated. There isn't another guy at Marvel, not even John Buscema, could have done as good a job as John Tartag did on that book. And of course, I put everything I had into it. And 2 books, Mother Teresa and Pope John Paul. And I'm telling you, those books, that was probably...
Because it was something in the material that really spoke to you and it was important to you, that you weren't going to cut, this was
I know
more
it.
than just another
Oh,
job.
I know it.
Right.
Well, as you know,
It should-
Pope John Paul, evidently he saw a Marvel comic book, and facetiously he said, "Gee, why don't they do a comic book on me?"
Right.
And I guess that's how it happened.
That's
you know?
well, actually, he was. I mean, I even published another one on about his whole life at my company now, Paper Cuts. And the thing about, I'm not an overly religious guy, but one of the brilliant things about this particular Pope is that he recognized he saw himself as, and he was a great communicator.
Right.
And he knew that speaking to children, if you want to keep something
Yeah.
going, you have to, get their attention. And if he's looking around and he sees them
He was
reading comic books or playing video games.
He was such a versatile person. He was a great skier, by the way, you
Yes.
know. And there was some clandestine happenings with the Germans when he was in Poland
Sure.
during World
Right.
War II. So it was really an interesting story. There's
I'll
no
have to give
question.
you a copy of our
Yeah.
book, yeah.
Really?
Yeah, it's actually, let me, can I have the catalog for just one? Just so you don't think I'm kidding you. We actually did one, will I find it in a second? Where did he go? There he
Jim, I
is.
think the convention officially...
Isn't that something?
Yeah, the show's over. But do I have to wrap it up? Where
Yeah.
did Ellen go? Anyway, I wish we had more time, but Alan already went home.
Yeah.
But thank everyone, thank John, Joe, Erwin. Thank
You did a good job.
Very good.
Pick one for the road, Mark.
Say Gandhi.
Gandhi.
With a smile.
I gotta wait for it to reset now. Oh, here we go.
Lover boy.
Very good.
I keep thinking of that song Loverman. Was Loverman?
Something else.